The United States entered the 20th century with half a mind to be a great power in world affairs, and half a mind not to. The United States by 1900 had the economic power to throw its weight around in world affairs, but it didn't yet have the mindset to do so, at least not to do so consistently. The half a mind that wanted to exert America's influence and power around the world belonged to people like Theodore Roosevelt. They were mostly in the Republican Party, but not all Republicans bought into this idea. But the ones who did, people like Theodore Roosevelt and Henry Cabot Lodge and Albert Beveridge and some other people, they had in mind that the United States should take its place as one of the great powers of the world, as befit what they saw as America's honor, prerogatives, and America's economic power. But a lot of other people still liked the idea that the United States was this country that was separate from Europe, which was really the cockpit of world affairs in those days. And they pointed out that the Atlantic Ocean separated the United States 3,000 miles from Europe. Some of them remember something that a French diplomat had said, that the United States, this was in the 19th century, that the United States was peculiarly blessed in being surrounded on the east by fish, on the west by fish, on the north by a weak country, Canada, on the south by a weak country, Mexico. And so with these buffers against impingement and these buffers against the necessity of engaging other powers, the United States could grow up with, well, the term isolationism would come along later, but with this idea that the United States did not have to engage the world on a regular basis, unlike countries like Germany or France or Britain or Italy, countries where their neighbors were right next door and their neighbors were often powerful and ambitious. The United States, they say, Canada, Mexico, fish, fish. And the United States could choose its spots. It didn't have to engage the world. Theodore Roosevelt and the Republican, mostly Republican, expansionists, imperialists had said, we're going to take the world on. We're going to become a great empire. But the American imperial enthusiasm faded quickly. Roosevelt became president in 1901. He was vice president to William McKinley. William McKinley was assassinated. Roosevelt became president. And Roosevelt would have been quite willing to engage more in this kind of imperial behavior, in this great power behavior, but he recognized that the American people, American Congress, simply wouldn't support it. He thought it was regrettable. He thought that Americans ought to take their place at the head of world powers, but if he couldn't talk the American people into doing it, then it simply wasn't going to happen. Roosevelt contented himself with exerting America's influence in a smaller part of the world, in the Americas. You could say this is half the world, not exactly, but the Western Hemisphere. And he asserted the right to redefine an old tradition in American foreign policy. The Monroe Doctrine dated back to the 1820s. And in this doctrine, President James Monroe had essentially said that the United States is going to take the leading position in the Western Hemisphere. Europeans, they should stay out. Europe for the Europeans, America for the Americans. Now, he was speaking sometimes kind of generically for Americans, including Canadians and Mexicans and Argentinians, Brazilians, and so on. But mostly he meant for the United States, Americans. But it was mostly a statement of this is the way the United States would like the world to be. The Monroe Doctrine, it was this traditional assertion of American interests and policy toward the Western Hemisphere, actually toward the world, because it said to the Europeans, you stay out of Europe. It said, we'll stay out of Europe, Europeans stay out of America. Americans will stay out of Europe. This doctrine, it gradually developed something of a position of honor and respect, at least among Americans. If you cited the Monroe Doctrine, it sounded like you were saying something that was really legitimate. It's worth noting these doctrines, the Monroe Doctrine and the other doctrines that would come along after it, they never had the endorsement of Congress. It was simply a statement by a president. They certainly didn't have the endorsement of other countries. So the other countries of the Americas were not asked their opinion on the Monroe Doctrine. Most of them would have said, forget it. You know, we're going to tend to our own affairs. We don't need you folks in the United States to look out for us in this way. But anyway, the Monroe Doctrine had been around since the 1820s. But it basically said, America for the Americans, Europe for the Europeans. Roosevelt added, well, what was called a corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. And the Roosevelt Corollary said that the United States will take upon itself the authority to exercise what Roosevelt called a police power in the Western Hemisphere if countries of the Western Hemisphere don't act right. So some countries in South America had fallen behind in their payments to German, in particular German and British creditors. And the Germans in particular decided to send gunboats to force the governments to pay up. And Roosevelt thought this was a really bad idea. Not that he thought that the debtors should be exempt from payment, but he didn't like the Europeans from coming in and wielding military power over countries of the Americas. So what Roosevelt told the Europeans, and at the same time to the Central and South Americans, was that the United States will do the debt collecting. The United States will act as the policeman in this hemisphere if a policeman is needed. Now, once again, Roosevelt did not consult the people of South America or Central America. He just stated it. He didn't consult the Europeans. The Europeans didn't much like the idea, but Europeans recognized that the United States was this growing power, and if Roosevelt was going to collect their debts for them, then they more or less acquiesced in it. This was a time when sphere of influence, diplomacy, politics, was relatively accepted among the great powers. So the British had their sphere in, well, for example, in East Africa and Southern Africa. The French had West Africa. Germany was trying to carve out a place for itself. The Germans were late into this imperial game because they didn't unify as their own modern empire until the 1870s. But anyway, this idea that the United States ought to have sort of first say in what happens in the Western Hemisphere. It was basically okay with the British. It was okay with the French. It was okay with the Germans. It wasn't necessarily okay with the Mexicans and the Costa Ricans and the Brazilians and the Argentinians and so on, but nobody was consulting them. The United States didn't pay much attention to what they said. Roosevelt simply asserted this. And he pursued something that gave rouse to a policy that under his successor, William Howard Taft, was called dollar diplomacy. And that was, Roosevelt and then Taft recognized that what was getting these Latin American governments into trouble was the fact that they were borrowing money from European creditors, and then one thing and another would happen and they wouldn't pay on time. And then the Europeans were tempted to send in the warships. And this was what had prompted the Roosevelt Corollary. So what Roosevelt and especially Taft did was to strongly encourage, to strong arm is not too strong a term, those Latin American governments to borrow money from the United States and use that money to pay off the Europeans. So if debts were owed, the debts would be owed to American creditors, and this was called dollar diplomacy. And the idea was basically to keep the loans in the American family, broadly construed, but also to give the United States greater legitimacy in putting the screws to Latin American governments if the screws needed to be put. Now, again, needless to say, the governments of the Latin American countries didn't much like this, except for those that were installed more or less at the behest of the United States. So the United States was acting as a great power within the Americas. The United States largely left Canada alone, but the countries to the south of the United States, especially going down through Mexico and Central America and the northern part of South America. And there was a reason for this. The United States really didn't care too much about what Brazil was up to, or Chile, or Argentina, or Uruguay, or Paraguay. The ones that are farther south, no. The United States had particular interest, though, in what was happening in the region around the Caribbean, because Theodore Roosevelt had this idea that the United States should build a canal. And in fact, he managed to underwrite a revolution in the northern part of Colombia, so that the independent country of Panama spun off of this. Roosevelt guaranteed the continued existence of Panama, And Panama, the new government of Panama, turned around and gave the United States rights to build a canal that would become the Panama Canal. So for Roosevelt, this was a really big deal. And this, at that time, the canal began construction during Roosevelt's term. It finally opened in 1914. By that time, Woodrow Wilson was president. But Roosevelt, for the rest of his life, thought that getting the canal constructed and opened was the greatest thing he ever did, because he thought it was good for the world. It shortened transit time from the Pacific to the Atlantic and vice versa. He thought it also conduced to American security, because the United States had naval ships in both the Pacific and the Atlantic, and once the Panama Canal was open, they didn't have to sail all around South America to get from one place to the other. Anyway, so this is Roosevelt, and he's exerting American authority, American power, I shouldn't say authority exactly, because that implies legitimacy, but American power in the Western Hemisphere, in Latin America in particular. And that's sort of where things lie when Woodrow Wilson becomes president. Woodrow Wilson was elected president in 1912. In the campaign, almost nothing was said about foreign policy. In fact, Wilson himself said to a journalist just before his inauguration that, the way he put it was, it would be the irony of fate, said Wilson, if foreign policy should play a large role in his administration. Well, this was in 1913, when Wilson was getting inaugurated. The very next year, Europe erupts into war, and in fact, foreign policy comes to dominate Wilson's presidency in a way that he hadn't anticipated, he hadn't trained for, and nobody expected. Now, this was not unusual in American political history. So, in fact, it is standard practice in American politics for presidents to be elected primarily for domestic reasons, domestic political reasons. This includes economic stuff. Foreign policy rarely plays a large role in American elections. Now, you might think that this is naive or wrong-headed or something, and at a certain level it is, but it also is quite understandable, because most people don't think about foreign policy much. They're much more concerned with their daily lives, what's happening in the United States. Do they have a job? Can they put a roof over their heads? Can they hope for a better future for their children? They think infrequently and cursorily about what's going on around the world. There is a small cadre of people for whom this is their profession, this is what they do, but they get the public's attention only occasionally. And so Americans, certainly by the 1910s, even though the United States had, again, the most powerful economy in the world, potentially the United States could have the most ambitious foreign policy in the world, but most Americans were not thinking in those terms, because if you were an American and let's suppose you were the age of Woodrow Wilson in 1912, and so you were in your 50s, and Wilson had been born in just before the Civil War. So this is the point, he had been educated in the days when the United States was not the greatest power in the world. And so he was educated at a time when the United States could not have played a huge role in world affairs, even if it had wanted to. Now, things changed during the course of his lifetime, but still, this notion of what the United States could do, it was a little bit kind of stuck back in that earlier time. This is why, when I cite my so-called Brand's fourth law of history, I say sooner or later, countries get the foreign policy they can afford. There's generally this lag time, and it's precisely because people get educated at a certain time in their lives, and the ideas that they form about the world, I won't say they are unchangeable after that, but they tend to be fairly sticky. And so Americans who were in their 40s, 50s, and 60s, the ones who were in decision-making positions in the 1910s, had been educated in the 1800s, when the United States still had a small economy, a smaller economy, and didn't have the capacity to exert its influence around the world. Anyway, so the war in Europe breaks out in 1914, and Wilson's first reaction was to do a George Washington. George Washington had declared American neutrality in the wars of the 1790s. Woodrow Wilson said essentially the same thing in 1914. He said the United States is going to be neutral. And he went beyond this, because neutrality is this formal concept. We're not going to align, we're not going to ally with any of the belligerents in the war. Wilson went beyond that. He asked Americans to be neutral, not simply in deed, but in thought as well. Now, this is a stretch because, okay, you can't even root for one side or the other. But Wilson felt obliged to do this because he understood that in 1914, something like a third of Americans were either immigrants themselves or the children of immigrants. And the vast majority of these immigrants came from Europe, from the very countries that were now at war. And so they were strongly inclined to root for one side in the war and against the other side in the war. So if you were from Britain, and many American immigrants were from Britain, you presumably would be rooting for the British side in the war. If you were from Germany, then you might very well be rooting for Germany, which is on the opposite side. So France and Britain were the main powers on one side. Russia originally in the war was on the side of France and Britain, but Russia dropped out of the war. And Germany and Austria were the main powers on the other side. And so Wilson recognized that there was going to be some rooting interest, and he didn't want to do this because he didn't want this to happen, because he realized that there would be pressure then on the United States government to side with whichever side voters were rooting for. So he asked Americans to be neutral in thought as well as their government in deed. This didn't work out so well, and one of the reasons it didn't work out so well was that most people in the United States thought that Germany was to blame. Germany had attacked neutral Belgium, and there didn't seem to be any good excuse for this. So there was that. Germany seemed to be the bad guy here. There was another aspect to this as well, that Wilson inherited from the 19th century this tradition of the United States in standing up for the rights of neutrals during wartime. And American merchants, American manufacturers, American farmers, they saw their business opportunities go straight up when the war broke out, because governments at war are willing to spend whatever it takes to get whatever they need to fight the war. And so the American economy had been in a recession when the war broke out in 1914, but very quickly orders came in from the belligerents, from the two sides in the war in Europe, and American products flew out the factory door, flew off the farm. And so it was boom times in America. And Wilson recognized this, and he wanted to get reelected in 1916, so he knew that if the economy was humming along, he'd have a better chance of getting reelected. But he also believed in the idea of neutral rights. And when, as had happened in the earlier wars of the 1790s and early 1800s, when the belligerents in World War I, I'll call it World War I, they were just calling it the World War or the Great War because there hadn't been a number 2 yet, when they start intercepting American ships and seizing American cargoes, and in the case of the Germans, sometimes torpedoing American ships, even killing Americans, this certainly was a violation of neutral rights, and it seemed to be a violation of American dignity and honor and safety and all this other stuff as well. So Wilson's idea that the United States would be neutral was strained from the beginning. And as I say, the belligerents were trying to stop American shipping, and they were violating American neutral rights, as had been done in those earlier wars. There was another angle as well. The belligerents, again, we'll focus on Britain and France on one side, Germany and Austria on the other side. They quickly ran out of money to keep the war going. Wars are really expensive. And they burned through the cash that they had. And so they needed to borrow money to keep the war going. And they came to America, particularly to New York, to Wall Street, and asked for money. They wanted to borrow money. They wanted to sell bonds on the American market. And there were Wall Street banks, Wall Street financial firms that were willing to do it because they would take their cut. But they realized this is potentially problematic, so they put the question to Woodrow Wilson, and they said, can we do this? And Wilson was strongly tempted to say no, because he recognized that where money went, American loyalties might follow. He recognized that if the United States, started being a heavy lender to one side or the other, there would be a strong incentive for Americans to side with that and make sure that side won so they'd get paid off. He initially was disposed not to, but he changed his mind when it was explained to him that, well, the recession will probably return, the economy will, the air will go out of the economic boom. And furthermore, it was sort of a surrender of neutral rights. So he talked himself into the idea that, okay, we're going to let the money go, but it's going to be, let the money go to Europe, but it will be done on a perfectly impartial basis. So the money went out, and it wasn't loaned out impartially because the British in particular had better connections to American finance than the Germans did. So most of the loans went to the British. Anyway, one thing and another finally put pressure on Wilson to think, this war is coming and we might as well get into it. He himself had basically abandoned the neutral concept. By early 1917, the Germans, recognizing this, declared open warfare by submarines on American shipping, on all neutral shipping. And so this basically forces Wilson's hand, and he takes the United States into war. He asks Congress for a declaration of war, saying the world must be made safe for democracy. That's the way he put it. It's not just for American interests, it's for the interests of democracy around the world. So Wilson had this idea that the United States was going to go to war to make the world safe for democracy. What he really had in mind was a new vision of what American foreign policy should be about. I said that Wilson grew up at a time when Americans sort of thought small in foreign policy. But Wilson had been a student of politics, a student of government, a student of international affairs. And he also had been watching very carefully what was going on in Europe at this time. And he concluded that for America's own safety, the United States needed to take a larger role in world affairs. And so step one was to enter this big war going on. But the point of entering the war was really to get a ticket, to get a seat at the peace conference that was going to follow the war, because Wilson had this new vision for what should follow the war. This war seemed to be the worst war that anyone could imagine. And so he was thinking, what can we do to make this the last war, the war to end all wars? And what he had was this idea, and it wasn't original with him, other people had thought about it before, but he had this in mind, something approaching a world government. He said the reason that war arises is that countries are all effectively outlaws one to the other, because there is no higher body to which Germany can, if Germany has a dispute with France or with Belgium or with Britain, there's no higher authority to which they can appeal that will then render a verdict and they'll resolve this peacefully. No, in fact, if they're not getting their way, they're strongly tempted to use the strong arm and resort to war. And this is what leads to war, thought Wilson. So what we need is something that will prevent this happening, something that will lead to peace rather than to war. And the whole idea, Wilson was a political scientist by academic training. He'd been a professor before he went into politics. And he was thinking in terms of government structures. So this government structure that he was thinking in terms of was something that was already being called a League of Nations, or the League of Nations. It was kind of a confederation of nations. And the whole idea was that when country A had a dispute with country B, instead of going to war with country B, it would take its complaint to the League of Nations. The League of Nations would act as this government or court or this adjudicating body. And this way, disputes could be resolved without war. Now, this was a best case scenario. What happened if country A didn't get what it wanted from the League? Well, country A might be tempted to attack country B and go to war. But this wouldn't happen because the League would be on record as basically being a world police force. So country A knew that if it attacked country B, then countries C, D, E, F, G, all the way down the alphabet, all the members of the League, would be sworn to resist, to defend country B and potentially attack country A. The idea was called collective security. And this collective security notion was, it potentially, at least on paper, it looked as though countries might be involved in wars all the time. Because if disputes among other countries, and in particular as it applied to the United States might get involved in a war between Germany and France, or something. It already was, but pick another country. So Poland and Russia, or something like that. And most Americans were thinking, well, why do we want to get involved in a war between Russia and Poland? And Wilson's answer was, our promise to get involved in that war will be exactly what will keep the war from breaking out. So collective security is designed to deter, to prevent aggression, just in the same way that people don't go around conking their neighbors on the head because they know that if they do, the police are going to arrest them and they'll get thrown in jail. And so the knowledge that you are going to be punished if you misbehave is what keeps people in line in domestic circumstances. The knowledge that a country will be punished if it misbehaves will keep countries in line. This was Wilson's goal. So the United States entered the war, the American side wins, and they all the belligerents go to Paris after the end of the war. And the Paris Peace Conference takes several months in the early part of 1919. And Wilson makes various concessions, but he comes home with the League of Nations. More precisely, it's written into the treaty that's going to end the war. It's called the Treaty of Versailles. The Treaty of Versailles, Versailles is a suburb of Paris. It's where the treaty was signed. And he comes home with the Treaty of Versailles, which includes the League of Nations. And he has to sell it to the U.S. Senate under the Constitution of the United States. A treaty has to be ratified by the Senate, in fact, by 2/3 of the Senate. And this is a big tussle because some people had made that transition from 19th century small America thinking to 20th century big, powerful American thinking, had made the transition that Wilson had made, but a whole lot of Americans had not. They were happy enough that the United States side had won during the war, but they weren't at all sure that they wanted to repeat the experience. And they were afraid that, well, there's just another war going to break out and the United States is going to get sucked back into that war. Well, Wilson made his argument for the League of Nations, for the Treaty of Versailles. It was an uphill battle because he had to get that 2/3 majority in the Senate. And in the Senate, he ran into the opposition of Henry Cabot Lodge, who was the Republican leader on foreign affairs in the Senate. And Lodge was opposed to the idea of a League of Nations. He was one who believed in a nationalist view, that the United States should look out for its own interests and its own interests first and foremost. He branded Wilson an internationalist who's thinking about the world affairs. Wilson did not deny being an internationalist, but he did deny not thinking about American interests. Wilson's point was that the United States will avoid future wars by taking greater responsibility for world affairs. We can't just back away, because the Europeans will be at war within another generation. We'll just have to do the same thing over again. So this debate took place. It took place in the Senate. It took place in larger Washington. It took place all around the country. Wilson made a speaking tour that took him around the country, and he seemed to be making some progress, but then he suffered a stroke. And in an unprecedented thing in American presidential history, something that never again has happened either, the president was essentially incapacitated for the last year and a half of his presidency. In the absence of his voice, the Treaty of Versailles and the League of Nations went down to defeat. The United States did not sign the Treaty of Versailles. The United States did not join the League of Nations. The American people, at least enough of them to prevent ratification, seemed to say, we don't want anything to do with this. And in fact, during the next 20 years, that's the position that the United States took. The United States took the position that we don't want to engage in world affairs. The 1920s and 1930s were a period of isolationism in American foreign policy. The United States deliberately kept its distance from the affairs of Europe and of Asia. This was a little bit harder to do for some in the 1930s with the rise of fascism, with Nazism in Germany, with fascism, in the formal name, in Italy, with a militaristic regime in Japan. As these countries began gearing up for war, beating up on their neighbors, some Americans said, we need to get involved. But more Americans said, no. We need to keep our distance. And so this fight between the isolationists and the interventionists marked American discussions of foreign policy in the late 1930s. These weren't resolved until Pearl Harbor, when Japan attacked the United States and made very clear that as much as the isolationists wanted to stay out of world affairs and wanted the United States to stay out of world affairs, the world wasn't going to let the United States. So with Pearl Harbor, with the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, the age of isolationism ended. A lot of people at that point said, President Wilson, by this time deceased, He was right. The world's not going to leave us alone, so we need to pay close attention. And from Pearl Harbor, December 7th, 1941, dates the beginning of the modern era of American foreign policy. And that's what we're going to discuss in the rest of the semester.